Hello there and welcome to the third episode of the Foxhole. This time around I'll be whipping out my magnifying glass because today's topic is micro versus macro and the role these terms play in various games. My name is Foxhound and without further dilly-dally, let's get started. Micromanagement or micro is a term that can have various meanings under various circumstances for various people when discussing games. Some people use it to indicate that you have a lot of control in a game. But what is control and what is a lot? Well, if you use the term as a verb like I have to micro this unit, it usually means having to control and pay attention to said unit. But micromanaging a unit to ensure that it performs optimally, that's a good thing, right? Then why is the term also used as a criticism of some games like this game has way too much micro? Also, what is macromanagement or macro and where does that fit into all of this? I will try to answer these questions and hopefully string together some sense of it all. And just as a note, I will only be talking in the framework of strategy games since they hold the greatest relevancy to micro and macro. I'm gonna give my definition of these terms right from the start and reference them throughout the video, hopefully so you can see how I arrived at these conclusions. Definition: micro is the amount of direct control you have in a game. Macro is a list of micromanagement steps you have to take to further your goal. One of the reasons I came up with this definition is that micro and macro are in fact the same thing, except to different degrees. Both are about your control in a game, but where micro manifests itself in the small-scale direct actions you take, like moving units around, macro represents your larger-scale collective plan of attack, like managing your economy. Micro is like the workers on a building. Without them, there is no building. Macro is like the architect. Without it, you end up with a shed rather than a skyscraper. As such, these two terms coexist in a symbiotic relationship with each other. This relative relationship between micro and macro is like a river that you have to cross. If it's so narrow that you can just jump over it, there is too little interaction, excitement, or challenge. If it's too wide, however, you struggle to get over and drown in frustration halfway there. So what is the right amount of micro and macro to have in a game? Well, that varies because the river isn't static. There are additional factors that add even more complexity to this question. One is the given subgenre, which determines how deep the river is. For instance, in Heroes of Might and Magic you have control over each of your castles, what buildings are constructed in them, and what units they produce. You also control each hero and their movement on the map, and in combat you control each type of creature as well. Heroes of Might and Magic is a turn-based franchise, which means you can take your time to do all these things. As such, even if the river was made twice as wide by doubling the amount of stuff to do in the game, it would be tedious to get to the other side, but this subgenre wouldn't make it so deep that you would drown. Now switch to the RTS subgenre, where micro still has the same meaning, but it deepens the river by introducing a complex problem. Case in point, Rise of Nations. The units in that game use a rock-paper-scissors combat system, where one unit class is weak against another, but strong against a third. As such, if your enemy was to just create one class of combat unit, you could easily figure that out and configure your army to defeat his. But in order to capitalize on that, you have to manually assign attack orders to your units, or they would just attack the enemies closest to them, regardless of class. When you spend your time doing this, it's time you can't spend on all the other stuff you have to manage, such as exploration, hiring new units, constructing buildings, researching upgrades, etc. So either you save time and make a weak army, or you have a good army but fall behind in the other areas. Because of this, micro in RTS is not simply the degree of control you have in a game, but it's also an attention allocation issue. Like I mentioned in episode 1, RTS games often exploit this exact problem to cause stress, which is one of the reasons why RTS games are fun. But the fun part is not always guaranteed, since the river still has to be narrow enough to make it possible for you to cross over. And it's not always apparent exactly how wide it should be, because of the way micro scales in games with differing sizes of scope. Scope isn't about the degree of control you have, but rather the vertical level of set control. For instance, in Surgeon Simulator, you control the fingers on your hands. In a typical VR game, you control both the character's hands and head movement. In Call of Duty, you control an entire individual. In Neverwinter Nights, you control several individuals in a group. In Total War, you control many groups of individuals. and in Majesty you control the kingdom and no groups or units whatsoever. Each example overtakes the previous one, not in the degree of control you have, but rather the type of stuff you control. If you look at one of these like Total War and compare it to Surgeon Simulator, you see a clear contrast in the type of control they present to the player. In Surgeon Simulator, all the control you have is very direct, immediate and hands-on, no pun intended. In Total War, where the scope is much larger, however, you still have some direct control, but there's much more stuff to manage and consider, like supply chains, army logistics, and so on. As such, I think that the greater the scope of a game, the greater the emphasis on macro rather than micro. If you play an RTS where you only control just one unit instead of an entire army, a large amount of control won't be such a problem because all your attention is focused on that one unit. Going back to Rise of Nations, however, some units also have special abilities which you then also have to micromanage in order to exploit said units' full potential. This can be quite a mouthful because you already have a lot to manage in that game. Contrast this to Company of Heroes, where you might say, wait a minute, there are more abilities in Company of Heroes and almost all units have several of them. That's true, but like I covered in episode 2, Company of Heroes also used the squad mechanic, and while it improved unit preservation and all that, it also reduced the degree of micro that units required. They did this by having a squad AI that makes sure the soldiers stay near each other, take cover automatically, dodge grenades that land near them, and if an enemy tank was charging, they would jump out of its way. This is by no means an insignificant step in reducing micro, and it meant that Relic could give the player other things to focus on, like abilities, phasing, flanking, etc. You might say they just swapped out one type of micro with another, and you'd be right. So why would that be a good thing? Because some types of micro are more fun than others, which is another factor that keeps the river from being static. We already discussed when there is too little or too much micro, but finding the right kind of micro is just as important. The question then becomes, how do we determine what good and bad micro is? Well, I mentioned how Relic used the squad mechanic and AI in Company of Heroes, and I'm gonna speculate as to their fundamental reason for doing so in the first place. I think they concluded it would be a good idea to introduce such a mechanic because they looked at the type of micro that was present in games back then. I think they realized that micro at such a small scope could quite often be frustrating, and that by scaling up the level of micro, they could make the game more about thinking rather than doing. By doing, I mean the physical act of clicking around to make your units go different places, target specific enemies, dodge their abilities, etc. All this is manual labor. It's stuff you have to do because the units in the game can't do it themselves. For instance, pathfinding or the lack thereof is a great example of manual labor. Imagine a strategy game where your units can't even go around obstacles without you manually having to click in beelines around them. Every strategy game has tried to alleviate this intense degree of micro because there is almost no element of strategy in such a tedious task. Having to manually guide units around obstacles is so far removed from you thinking about how to win the game. And to a certain extent, the closer you get to thinking about macro in a strategy game, the more fun you're likely going to have. Now, an obvious exception to this are games like StarCraft, a game that celebrates clicks per minute in all its micro glory. This means that the topic of micro is not only hard to pinpoint, it's also like cooking a dish where the only known ingredient on the recipe is salt. In the vast majority of games, however, it all comes down to personal preference, whether you like to be doing or thinking. My personal preference tilts toward the strategic, so I guess my closing remarks will be the following. Micro keeps you busy, but macro makes you think. Thank you so much for watching. Which game do you think strikes the perfect balance between micro and macro? Tell me in a comment below. If you enjoyed this video, drop me a like. If you want more of these videos, do subscribe, and if you'd like to support me, you can donate on PayPal. See you next time.